Hello everybody, this is Dan Miller for Bluegrass Unlimited magazine, and today I'm going to start a little series that I'm going to call Bass Basics. It's been a while since we've done any lessons on the bass, and we haven't done very many of them considering all the lessons we've done on guitar, mandolin, banjo, and fiddle, and even dobro. The bass has lagged behind, so I thought I'd just start with some very simple bass things for beginners. If you're beginning to the bass, these will be some concepts for you to think about. And then we'll kind of, progress from there and go in a little series on playing the bass. Okay? So the first thing I want to talk about, I think I mentioned in the last bass lesson I did, is that as a bass player, you want to think about, okay, what are my jobs? What am I there to do? Okay, number one is to keep time. All right? And just basic, be able to play right on the beat. That's the basic thing. Okay, later you can do more complicated things about getting in grooves, setting grooves, when to lay the note in, when to cut it off, how to use dynamics to create groove, all that kind of thing. But first thing, just worry about being on the beat, being in time. Okay, that's your first job. Second of all, you're going to help the rest of the rhythm section outline the harmonic content of the song, which means playing the chords. Now you're not going to play a full chord, you're going to play single notes out of the chord usually. Sometimes you can play more, but usually you're just going to play single notes, but notes out of the chord. And for those that don't know, every chord is made up of three notes, whether it's a major chord, minor chord, diminished chord, or augmented chord. A chord is only three notes. If it has more notes, we call it extensions, a chord with extensions. So we're going to define a chord as three notes. And if you're playing over that chord, you play notes out of the chord. Now typically on the bass, we're going to play, we can play all three notes of the chord, but a lot of times you're just going to play two, or even one, which is typically the root. Okay, so we'll talk about that. And the next job you have is help leading the listener's ear to the next chord change when the chords are about to change. Now you're going to do that with your bass runs, okay? And we'll talk about bass runs in another video. And the fourth job is really just to add interest, okay? And this is kind of a subjective thing because some people add interest, maybe get too busy with adding interest and detract from the soloists or the singers, and you don't want to do that. You want to have be able to tastefully add interest. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. And maybe we'll go over some of those simpler things later. But first, this first video, I just want to focus on that idea of how do you provide that harmonic content and how to best do that in using different patterns on your bass. Okay, that's just the basic thing to do. Today we're just going to cover some ideas about patterns to use and how they apply to the most common keys and the easiest keys to deal with, which is typically your the key of G, the key of C, the key of D, the key of A. Let's cover those. They're very common in folk and bluegrass music, and they're probably the easiest to approach on the bass. In bluegrass, key of B flat, key of B is not that uncommon, but a little bit more difficult. We'll talk about that next time. But today we're just going to talk about some keys that are more easily approached on the bass, when you're playing bass, especially upright bass. Okay, so like I said, you're going to play typically one of the notes out of the chord, and it's either going to be the root or the root and the fifth. And you could play the root the whole time. You could just go G and then go to C, D, back to G. If it's a 1-4-5 progression in G like that, you could do that, which would be fine, but it could get a bit monotonous. Alternating the root of the key in the chord, and then with the fifth scale degree, which is also a note that's in the chord, is going to be a little bit more interesting, okay? We'll add more interest later by walking arpeggios and things like that, but let's not worry about that now. We're just going to talk about playing the root and the fifth and alternating that, okay? The third is what we call the color note, because if it's a major third, it's a major chord. If it's a minor third, it's a minor chord. So the third is kind of going to define major or minor. And if you're new to bass, the good news is if you're just playing 1/5 and the song goes to a minor chord, you don't have to worry about where that minor third is or how that minor is played, because you can just play 1/5 still and be fine, okay? We'll talk about different kinds of chords later, but right now I just want to define three basic ways of alternating your root and your fifth note. Three basic patterns that you can use on the bass, okay? I'm going to make up names for these so we could talk about them in context. These are my made-up names. They're not any kind of standard names. The first one I'm going to call the neighbor, okay? So we're just going to play open G. Now open G, the fifth, if we're over the G chord, the fifth is the D, which is right next to it. Same positions, open, right? So that's why I call it the neighbor. It's right now. If you play any string, even if you're at any position, the note right next to it at that same position to the lower pitch side is a fifth away. Okay, so here's a G. A fifth away from that is D, which both are open here. Now if I wanted to go up to A, I could play that note next to it, which is, again, the fifth up from A, which is E. So once you get these position patterns down, you can move them around. We'll talk about moving them around next time to get in different keys, okay? So that's the first one I'm going to talk about. I'm going to call it the neighbor. The next one I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to call the diagonal, because it's if you're playing a closed position, it's this diagonal or this big spread. Now if you're playing open, like an A, you're going to play A and E, okay? So it's diagonal on the next string down. So if it's D, you can play A. If it's E, you play B. So it's E, B, A, E, D, A. That diagonal pattern is what you are going to use if you are playing what I call the diagonal. And like later I said, you can move it up. This is the position here, but the nut here is fretting that for us. If we start moving up, we have to, fret two notes, but we'll talk about that later. The next position I'm going to call the string skip, just for lack of a better term. So if I'm playing a C note here and I want to play the fifth above C, which is G, I can skip over the D string and just play the open G, okay? You can do that from G. If I'm at G and I want to play the fifth open D, so I'm skipping over the string and playing the next open note. So those are the three common patterns that you might use, and you can move those up the neck. That last one, the skip string, is probably not going to be used very much when you go up the neck, but the other two are the neighbor and the diagonal. Again, my terms for those things. So let's explore those things in the context of 1-4-5 progressions in the keys I mentioned earlier: G, C, D, and A. Those keys, because they lay out nicely on the upright bass. And let's see how you might use those patterns in different ways to play a 1-4-5 progression in those keys. Okay, now given those positions that we talked about, let's just look at the key of G. Now the easiest thing to do is use as many open notes as you can, okay? So typically in the key of G, I can get my 1, 5, and G open. G string, D string, okay? And then when I go to C, I have to fret that C note. So I can fret that C note here and then play the open G using that string skip. So for G chord, we're going to use our neighbor, what we're calling our neighbor note. And for C, we're going to use that string skip thing. So again, I can take advantage of that G string being open. For D, again, I can open. D, A, D, A, D, A. So basically for a 1-4-5 in the key of G, I only have to put my finger down on the fingerboard for one note, that's the C note. To me, that's the easiest way to play a 1-4-5 in the key of G, right? So other options you have is you can do your G here, right? And you could do the string skip thing to go G, D and play open, or you could do your spread here, there, a little more difficult, okay? And also, a lot of times that low E string can be a bit muddy. It doesn't pop out as well as that when you're playing. So typically I won't choose that as my first choice if I'm playing like a hard driving bluegrass song where I really want the strings to pop out. In jazz, when I play jazz, it's a little bit different because I like to walk an arpeggio off of that G, and then I can walk the arpeggio back down from the high G, but we'll talk about that kind of thing later. But for standard bluegrass, I just like those open strings popping and only having to fret that C here. Now the other option there is you could do a neighbor C instead of going C to a high pitch G. You could go C to a lower pitch G using the neighbor, or you could do the spread or the diagonal there again, but that's a little more difficult, okay? So those are options for the C. Now for the D, again, we could play it open, or we could use the, go there for that D to this A note on the G string. So that's another option. When you choose to use these different options, for me, if it's a hard driving fast bluegrass song, I'm probably just going to stick with those open notes. The times when I would use some of those others is just to add some interest. You know, if you're always popping along D here, sometimes if it stays on the D a long time, it might be good to add that higher note A in there just for some kind of a variation or variety or different texture or tone over that D chord. That's one reason why you might choose one of these other positions that might be more difficult or might not lay out as well, is just to add some interest and some texture instead of doing a repetitive thing, okay? That's the key of G. The key of D is very easy because you don't have to fret anything. You don't have to use your hand at all. D, you can play here, right? And then over the 4 chord, G, play open here. And then over the 5 chord, A, you can play there. So you never have to fret anything. When my daughter was learning how to play bass, she had to play bass in a school talent show with her sister, and she was too small to reach up here, so I just had them do something in the key of D, and she never had to fret anything. So, you know, that's good news about the key of D. You don't have to fret anything, but a lot of times you might want to play the D here and then go to the G over here, and then maybe do this one for the A instead of going down to that low E string. Because again, that E is going to pop better than that low E. But you might want to alternate between the two just to have some variation. Okay, that's another reason. Okay, so what other keys can we talk about? Key of C. Typically, I'll do the C and then the skip string to G. Sometimes I'll do the C and the G there. Okay, again, many times just for variety. When you go to the 4 chord in C, which is an F chord, I'll typically go to that neighbor note because this is C, G, and then you could go 4 chord F, C. That's the same as playing D open as the 1 and G over here as the 4, it's the same pattern basically, but you're just playing a different part of the neck. Okay, so then your last chord, your 5 chord in C is going to be G, and you can just play it like you would before, either open there, or you could, play it G, D like that, or you could play this again. You have the option of all 3 of those positions that I talked about on playing the G or the C. You can play the C like this. You can play the C like this. You have those 2 options for C. Same with F. You can play it here, or you can play it with the spread, the diagonal, what I call the diagonal position. You could do it there as well. It just depends on what's easiest for you, what kind of variety you want to add to what you're doing. The last key we'll talk about is the key of A. Okay, for A, you can play A here, which is that diagonal. You can play A here, which is that neighbor. Okay, so you could play the A and the E here, or the A here and the E there. Also something in the key of C, obviously you could play the F here, which is a little bit more difficult and a little bit more low-end, muddy kind of sounding, but that's also an option. So in the key of A, you're going to have the A chord, and then you're going to have the D chord, again, which you could play open, or you could play as the diagonal, right? And then you're going to have an E chord. In E, you could play here. You could do there if you want to get that high note in there. So those would be your options to play the 5 chord in the key of A. So if you've been playing bass for a little while, this is nothing new to you. If you're just trying to learn how to play the bass, what I recommend is you get familiar with all those positions and patterns, and then you mix them up a little bit. Get one down, like in the key of G, get the standard G, C, D, get that one down, get that, sort of in your muscle memory, and then play around with some of the others and get those in your muscle memory, and then mix and match them and see what sounds good to you in providing a little bit of interest. You're not really doing anything different note-wise. You're still playing a root and a fifth, but you're alternating between different octaves, and that sometimes adds enough interest to be a little bit less monotonous than just playing the same pattern over and over again. So the next time what we're going to do is talk about other keys that, like B flat and B and E, where you're going to have to use your left hand a little bit more, and we're going to talk about how to use a 1-4-5 pattern so that you don't have to memorize. If you know the pattern, you don't have to memorize, okay, wow, what is the 4 chord in B flat? You don't have to know that. You just got to know where your root is and then know the pattern, the 1-4-5 pattern. So next time we'll talk about that, so that it would maybe be easier for you to play in keys like E flat, B flat, some of these keys that might be less likely to play in, but you never know. You know, especially in bluegrass, B and B flat are played a lot. Sometimes, you might run across somebody, a singer, that wants to sing in E flat or some other key that's not as common. But if you know these patterns, it'll be easier for you, and we'll talk about that next time. Okay, for now, this is Dan Miller for Bluegrass Unlimited magazine. Have fun exploring the bass.